and welcome to part 3 of the Introduction to Evaluation that the Ruth Mott Foundation put on in August of 2016. My name is Liz Delaney and I'm the Learning Officer at the Foundation. So part 3 is really about different data collection techniques and how we're going to use those to collect information as far as our outputs and outcome measures. Some of this information will be review for you and some of it will be pretty new for you. There's also quite a few more data collection techniques. However, I really just tried to pick the most popular and most useful for our grantees. So a question I have for the crowd is, how many of you started your career with the plan of helping people? And then how many of you plan to collect, organize, house, and interpret data? Probably a few of you out there. And then how many of you had extensive training, such as training in school, before starting your career on organizing, housing, and interpreting data? Maybe a few of you. So what we found through research was that there are really 3 major challenges to data collection. The first is lack of time. So a lot of organizations find that evaluation takes a considerable amount of time, or they think that evaluation is going to take a considerable amount of time. Along with that, there is a lack of money associated with the evaluation and the time it takes to do evaluation. Oftentimes, organizations may not include that line item in their grant proposals. And the third thing is lack of training. So as the last slide probably spoke to most of you, a lot of people in organizations started working, especially in nonprofits, to help people, and that is their main focus. The main focus of the organizations that we fund is to do the work that we fund, not necessarily to do evaluation. However, as we've discussed in earlier sections of this presentation, that the evaluation is, an integral part of the work that we're doing and really can help us do a better job, but also sustain our funding. Generally, program staff are in charge of all things that are data, and again, that program staff generally has started working in the organization because they like the work the organization is doing and may not necessarily have the experiences around data collection and storage and analysis. The foundation is really working to help with the training aspect, hence these videos and the training that we offer to our grantees. We do assist with funding for grants. It's really up to organizations to make an effort to integrate evaluation into everyday work in order to help with the lack of time. And, I think that really goes to making sure that the evaluation work that you're doing is in line with the work that you're doing as well, and planning ahead so that you can make sure that that it's easy to integrate this and is not something that really exhausts your organization. So there are 2 primary types of data collection techniques, and most people are pretty familiar with primary data collection techniques. So primary data collection is when you collect the data yourself in your organization. So for example, if you give surveys to your participants, that would be an example of a primary data collection technique. Additionally, if you do focus groups, interviews, some sort of observation or experiments with the people that receive services from you, that would all be primary data collection. This type of data collection can include qualitative and quantitative data. So just a reminder, a refresher, qualitative data includes stories and text. It gives that rich depth of information. And quantitative data is generally numbers. You can generally make some graphs and charts. So key benefits to primary data collection are that it's specific to your needs, and it's very specific to exactly what you're doing, and you control the quality. So you have to be careful when you are doing primary data collection, making sure that you use the best methodology possible, making sure your questions are not biased, and things like that. The key disadvantage to primary data collection is that it usually costs more and probably will take a little bit longer because you have to get people to participate and do quite a bit of planning. So on the flip side, secondary data analysis is, or data collection, is actually data collection that someone else has already done. And so you as an organization are not collecting the data. It's already been done for you. So maybe someone else has given a survey and your organization is just accessing the data from the survey. So for example, in Flint, we have a survey that's called Speak to Your Health. And that's a survey that someone else has already given. If your organization wanted to use the data from that survey, you would ask those who administered the survey if you could have access to the data, and then you would be using secondary data if you used the data from the Speak to Your Health survey. Again, this can either be qualitative or quantitative data. The key benefit is that it is usually very cheap and quick. And I say usually because sometimes in order to get secondary data, sometimes you have to pay for it. And then the key disadvantage is that sometimes the data can be too old for you to use, or it may not be specific enough to meet the needs of your organization. I'm going to actually go through a few data collection techniques, and I'm starting with the primary data collection techniques because I think that those are the techniques that most organizations are familiar with. And so I'm going to go through document analysis, surveys, focus groups, and interviews, mostly because those are the ones that I think will be most relevant to our grantees. So I have document analysis under primary data collection. It technically can be either primary or secondary. That's not necessarily as important to us as what it is. And so the reason I put this technique in here is because I actually think it would be very useful to quite a few of our organizations that are not currently using it. So document analysis actually uses records or documents in order to collect data. And you can use it for both qualitative and quantitative data collection. So some examples are, let's say you're a youth serving organization and you're interested in collecting grades and attendance. Instead of, putting in a data request from the school district, you can actually ask the parents to bring in report cards and have and collect the data from the report cards that the parents bring you. And so you can get the grades and attendance straight from the report cards. You could also, after getting parental consent and consent from the school district and schools, send an evaluation form to school with the youth of your program and ask for teacher feedback. You do need to be aware of some FERPA issues you may run into with that, and it's important that you have parental consent and information or approval from the school district and the schools in order to do that. And the last bullet is really the other piece of it that I think pertains to most organizations, specifically those working with youth. sometimes when you're trying to collect data, maybe you don't have enough information on what types of questions to ask. And so generally you might use a qualitative method where you are reading through information and looking for themes that come out. So you can have maybe the youth in your program keep journals about the work that they're doing in your program and maybe the changes that they're experiencing from it. And then you and maybe someone else are going to read through the journals and actually look for themes or common trends that are coming about throughout the youth's journals that you read. And so that is, a qualitative method. You have to be, pretty careful with the way that you're interpreting those and really asking for feedback from the youth. But it is an option, especially if you're unsure exactly how to ask questions or what your response categories should be in your surveys. Another primary data collection technique is surveys. Most people are pretty familiar with surveys. Many people have taken surveys. Some people have written surveys. The pros to using surveys are that it can be used with many people. It's relatively cheap. Participants can remain anonymous in that, and so that allows you to ask questions that may be a little bit more sensitive. You can get standardized results, so you can compare groups over time and between different groups. It allows for relatively easy analysis and easy, I guess, is relative depending on how comfortable you are with different data analysis techniques or statistical methodology. It can be generalizable if your sample is chosen appropriately. Some cons are that if you're writing the survey yourself or picking from other people's surveys, questions can be easily biased. And so it's important that you test the questions out and if possible try to use questions from surveys that have already been given and tested. So a lot of times when I would teach research, I would tell my students that they always had to do a project at the end of the semester, and if they chose to write a survey for their project, I always told them that that's their whole project, because in order to really write a very good survey that gets at a concept such as happiness, then you really need to make sure that you are testing that survey with the population of interest, that the questions are getting at what you want to, that it's reliable and valid, and all of that. And we will cover surveys a bit more in the workshop trainings in September, so stay tuned for that. It is possible that you can miss other important information if your questions are too restrictive. And I think one question right now where I'm seeing a lot of people miss possible information is around gender. So many people are still including only 2 categories for gender when there are more categories for gender than 2. And so if you only have male and female and you have someone who identifies as another gender, then you're actually, missing that person and maybe making them feel like they don't fit in your program as well. The final con for surveys is that it requires literacy. So, be aware of that. Make sure that the readability of your survey is at a grade level that is equivalent to what your participants can read. If people don't have, if people can't see, maybe provide glasses and or have somebody around that can read the survey to them. Focus groups are another primary data collection technique. So focus groups are actually used with participants when you want to get a group of people together to discuss sort of a common topic. And those people generally have something in common with each other. So maybe they all work at the same place, they might be a similar age group, They might all have family members that have a certain type of job, right? And you get them together and you sort of have a guided discussion where, if I was giving a focus group, I would be the facilitator of this discussion. I would have a list of open-ended questions I would like to have answered. And then, you guide the focus group to have a discussion about those questions. So it's relatively easy to do, although you have to be very aware of power dynamics. And so, if I'm someone who's worked with the group of people that I'm giving the focus group to, maybe it's a group of youth and I want to know how they felt about the program that I designed, I personally may not be the best person to give that focus group because the youth may feel like they need to tell me a specific answer to make me feel good and keep our relationships going. So it's relatively easy, but definitely be aware of power dynamics. Some other pros, you can hear what people say, but you can also see some nonverbals. So if people are disagreeing, sometimes you see nonverbals, you can ask about them or you can note them. You can see conversations and interactions of participants, and it's good to use before a project starts to get feedback for an area of concern, just to see if you're on the right track. Some cons are that responses are heavily influenced by other participants. And so, if you do 2 of the same focus groups, but with different participants, you may have completely different results based on where a conversation is headed. Another con is that sometimes what people say isn't really what they do. And so you're getting attitudes and beliefs, but you're not really measuring behaviors. Another thing is that sometimes you'll get a person in your focus group that is going to dominate the conversation, or may not talk at all. And so you really have to develop some skills in order to engage people appropriately that are not speaking quite as much. Make sure you have a quiet location with few distractions. That's a pretty safe place. It could be tough to analyze depending on what sort of methodology you use. So, a very formal methodology for focus groups is really that you audio record the focus group, and then you send it to someone to transcribe. Then you have a group of people actually go through and analyze and code. And by code, I mean you're looking for themes. In the discussion, you would then summarize those themes of your group of people who's been reading through the transcripts. Those summaries are then sent to the focus group participants, who can say, yes, that's what we said, or no, that isn't what we said. You include their feedback in your analysis. You don't change your analysis, but you include it, and then you can go ahead and complete your summary. Sometimes in order to get around this, what people will do is actually use a focus group to guide, a discussion where maybe you write information on the board that they can all say, yes, we agree to that, or no, we don't, to gather information in sort of a different way. So it can be time consuming. It's not always great for measuring outcome data because you're not measuring exactly the same thing every single time, because every conversation you have can be quite a bit different, and it's hard to tell, if there's real gains or not. And so again, you should not be using you shouldn't be using stories without numbers, and you shouldn't be using numbers without stories. So I'm not going to talk in too much detail about interviews, because interviews are very similar to focus groups. However, with interviews, you're only meeting one-on-one with somebody. It can, again, be time consuming, but generally you would pick an interview over a focus group, mostly if the topic that you're discussing is too sensitive to discuss in a group of people. So another type of data collection technique, again, is the secondary data sources. So again, secondary data sources are using data that someone else has already collected. So you can use secondary data sources if the data is current and still being collected or uses the time frame that you're interested in. So there are surveys that have been done in the past that have not continued over time, and as an organization you have to determine if that would still be useful to you. You obviously want to make sure that you're using secondary data sources that are relevant to your evaluation questions. So don't just use a source because it's a good source. It really has to fit within the scope of what you're doing. Don't assume that a secondary data source is automatically a great data source, because it needs to be verified, it has to be unbiased, and it has to be collected using good methodology. And if you are using somebody else's data, it is really up to you to determine if it is a dependable, accurate, unbiased source. And so you do need to know what type of methodology was used to collect it, what types of questions were asked, and how the sample was chosen, so on and so forth. In your materials, there's a list of publicly available data sources. I tried to focus on sources that are relevant to Flint. What I will say in this section is that a couple things are pretty important about that sheet. One, you can see the websites that are listed. You can see the topics that are included in the websites. And I really encourage you to look at all of the websites, because I did have to limit the amount of information I was putting on the sheet to keep it short. But geography is something that people don't always know or understand. So I'm going to give you a brief explanation of geography. So everyone knows you can have data on the entire world. That's the largest geography, right? Beyond the entire world, we obviously have countries. And then in the United States, below countries, we have regions. Below regions, we have states. Below states, we have counties in Michigan. In counties, we can then even break it down even further. So there's metropolitan statistical areas, which I'll talk about in just a minute. We have zip codes. We have below zip codes, and actually, I don't know if I can say exactly below, but we have something called census tracts. And below census tracts, we have block groups, then we have blocks, and then we actually have parcels. So parcels would be the actual, house or piece of land, I should say. And then blocks are made up of several pieces of land, and then block groups are made up of several blocks. And then census tracts are made up of several block groups. So in North Flint, we have about 26 census tracts that are represented, and we at the Ruth Mott Foundation are using 48504, 48505, and 48506 as our zip codes. I would prefer to use census tracts when we're collecting publicly available or secondary data sources that have census tracts available, because if you look at our map and the map of zip codes, you'll see that there's not that there are some places where 48504 goes outside of the boundaries, and actually 48503 goes inside some of the boundaries. So the zip codes are not really a perfect fit, but the census tracts are actually a pretty good fit. So it's important to know what geography you're looking at when you're looking at these different data sources. The other thing I will say about that is be very careful of any sources that say Flint MSA. So MSA is Metropolitan Statistical Area, and in larger areas that have a certain population, the census does make, and this is especially true with the unemployment data, especially if you want really current unemployment data, they'll use the Flint MSA. Flint MSA geography is actually exactly the same as Genesee County. So if you're looking, for example, at the unemployment rates for the Flint MSA, it's going to be about half what it is in Flint City. So don't assume because it says Flint MSA or Flint Metropolitan Statistical Area that is Flint City. That's actually Genesee County. So be very careful of that as you're looking through the sources. We will have a little more experience with this at the workshops in September, but I would really encourage you to look through all of this information. So the question is always, how do we pick? How do we pick what we're going to use? So the first thing is that you need to have data sources that are relevant to what you're interested in. You really need to think about the effort that your organization can put into collecting this data and whether it's reasonable given the other things that you have to do in your organization. And if it's not, what is another way you can go about it? Cost is always important. Don't just look at the upfront cost, but look at the ongoing cost of getting things done. Is it replicable, and can you compare it over time? And that's really important, especially if you want to see if you've had some sort of growth. And then the final thing is, what type of control do you have over the data source, and how important is that control? So some recommendations to implement data collection. The first thing is that you need to start small. Don't try to, eat the entire cake, eat it one little bite at a time, right? The second thing is make sure that you connect your goals to your mission. The closer your goals of your evaluation are to your mission, the easier it is to get staff buy-in as well as participants that are in the programs to buy in, and it's easier to keep yourself motivated. The third thing is learn from others who are doing similar work. And that's a really important thing. I'm hoping that we do in September when you come for the workshops. That's going to be the focus on a lot of it. How are other organizations that are doing similar work as you gathering data and using it effectively? Make sure that as an organization you value data. So always, if you're gathering something, report out to your staff, to yourself, as well as to the participants in the program. And then finally, make sure you're training the staff. Don't just assume because you've written a survey that the staff automatically know how to administer that survey. All right, that concludes part 3 of this training. Please continue to part 4, and I look forward to seeing you in a few. Bye-bye.